Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us at the Just Wage Forum 2021. My name is Dan Graff. I'm a U.S. labor historian at the University of Notre Dame, where I also direct the interdisciplinary Higgins Labor Program here at the university's Center for Social Concerns. Named for Catholic priest, labor economist, and worker advocate Monsignor George Higgins, the Higgins Labor Program explores questions about work, the politics of work, and the work of social justice, all through the lens of Catholic social tradition, which emphasizes such principles as the dignity of work, the right of everyone not only to decent work, but also a voice at the workplace, solidarity with the marginalized, and a commitment to the common good. The major research initiative of the Higgins Labor Program is our Just Wage Initiative, which probes the foundational question rooted in Catholic social thought: what makes any given wage just or unjust? And the major fruit of that research from the past few years is our new Just Wage framework and online tool, a resource for professors, policymakers, and practitioners. I'm going to try to share my screen here. Appreciate your patience. There's the Just Wage Initiative. The idea is to create a resource for everyone from employers to union activists to parish and community groups to engage just wage questions and to come away committed to contributing to promoting a fairer, more inclusive, more sustainable, indeed a more just economy. Today's the final session of our Just Wage Forum for 2021. For the past several months, we've featured policymakers, professors, and practitioners, all riffing on our Just Wage framework of 7 interrelated criteria. After an initial overview in February, each session has focused on one of the 7 Just Wage criteria, and each has featured a scholar researcher on the one hand and practitioner activists on the other, followed by comments by a member of our own Just Wage Working Group. If you missed any of those prior sessions or you would like to re-engage them, I encourage you to visit the Just Wage Forum 2021 website, which has links to all of the videos. Today we feature our 7th and final criterion. A just wage considers performance, qualification, and type of work. As we see it, a just wage should reflect compensation for experience, education, and training. It should be informed by regularized and standardized evaluations measuring job performance. And it should be part of a broader wage structure that features transparent and fair delineations of titles, functions, and job descriptions. To me, this is one of the most challenging of our 7 criteria, mostly because of the difficulty in prioritizing the principles of fairness and equity and measuring the value of workers' worth within a system motivated by profit-making and premised as it is on an imbalance of power between employers and workers. So that's why I'm so interested in hearing from today's presenters, whom I'll introduce shortly. I encourage you to visit our website to learn more about this criterion and the others, as we've put together a set of resource pages organized into the following categories. What does CST say? What does research show? What's the law? And who does it well? In a few, hopefully crisp paragraphs, we've designed each resource page to introduce the topic and point the reader to other resources for deeper exploration. Thanks in advance for joining us today. And thanks too to my colleagues at the Just Wage Working Group and more generally at the Center for Social Concerns, especially our acting executive director, Bill Purcell, for all his support, our communications team for all their active efforts assisting with promotion and technology, and last but not least, Judy Benchar, the Higgins Labor Program's administrative assistant. As we turn to the content of today's session, let me say a note about protocol and participation. For attendees, we ask that you use the Q&A function to raise questions or comments throughout the presentations and afterward. We'll do our best to prioritize questions and address as many as we can in the 90 minutes that we have. For those we don't get to, we can always try to follow up outside the session via email and the like. So thanks again for joining us, and we'll turn now to the presentations. Today's first presenter is Kate Maich, Assistant Professor of Labor and Employment Relations at the Pennsylvania State University, as well as an affiliate faculty member in Sociology, Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, and Latin American Studies. Professor Maich holds a Ph.D. in Sociology from the University of California, Berkeley, and I want to add as well a B.A. in English from the University of Notre Dame. Maich's research and teaching interests include gender and race, law, labor informality, domestic work, digital organizing, and ethnography. Her recent publications include Of Whom and Whom, Embeddedness of Law in the Regulation of Difference, an essay in political power and social theory. Maich was named a 2020 New Labor Scholar by the Labor Research and Action Network, and she's a member of the Global Research Network for Domestic Worker Rights. She currently serves as the chair of the Latin American Study Association's Labor Studies section and as the Secretary Treasurer of the American Sociological Association's Labor and Labor Movements section. We're delighted to have Professor Maich join us and share some of her research and thoughts on this question of a just wage. And I turn it over to you now, Kate. Thanks so much.
Wonderful, thanks. I so appreciate it, Dan, and I just want to thank you and Judy, Stacia, everyone at Higgins for not only coming up with this really exciting idea, but sort of maintaining it throughout the last 15 months, right? When we were all in a kind of moment of uncertainty. So I'm really excited today to be joining you all virtually to sort of, reflect on this criterion and kind of bring some of these conversations forward that we've, been having over the last few months and have some interesting discussion about them. So I'd actually like to just share my screen with you all and share a PowerPoint that I've put together here just to kind of walk us through my presentation today. And again, I just, kind of want to say, thinking back, if I were to have given this talk, in March of 2020, right, I think my comments would have been very different, and the same probably goes for all of us. I think Andrew Schenk reflected on this as well during his talk, and several other panelists have, but in an important way, right? We have sort of evolved in our thinking, right, throughout the pandemic, and what that actually has done to our thinking and our understanding about the importance of just wages and their meaningfulness for workers' lives. So I'm really excited to be here again with kind of a different talk than I would have been giving in the past. So just to sort of jump in, I'd like to just draw our attention briefly to this point about what Catholic social teaching says in terms of this idea here around the just wage and around this specific criterion. So Pope John the 23rd notes here, the remuneration of work is not something that can be left to the laws of the marketplace, nor should it be a decision left to the will of the powerful. Moreover, a just wage framework must consider the effective contribution which each individual makes to the economic effort. So as I move through my talk today, I'd like us to kind of keep in mind this idea of the will of the more powerful. When employment relations, which is what I look at, especially for informal workers and workers who have kind of long been cast to the margins, have either legally or practically not been able to form unions or worker associations, and have often been kind of left out of broader conversations about workers' rights and protections and benefits. What does it mean for them if we think about just wages and this idea of kind of the will of the more powerful when we have such a skewed kind of employment relation system, so much so that the worker may not even have that actual category applied to them, right? They may be considered an independent contractor, which I'll be talking a little bit more about today. So this idea of the kind of will of the more powerful, when we really think what a just wage is considering, I'd like to push us to sort of see what it maybe hasn't considered for informal workers and what in fact that really could look like. And what I'll sort of argue today, or what I'll try to show today, is that we really need to consider a racialized and gendered framework when we're thinking about just wage for informal workers. And sometimes in so doing, that actually pushes us to kind of consider the very discriminatory origin story of these wages as they stand. So for instance, thinking about domestic work, right? Really looking at the institution of slavery and looking at these legacies that continue to shape the kind of marginal wages that workers in these industries earn. So the criterion states that a just wage reflects compensation for experience, education, and training. It's informed by regularized and standardized evaluations measuring job performance, and it's part of a wage structure featuring transparent and fair delineations of titles, functions, and job descriptions. So let's just sort of keep that in mind when we try to wrap our minds around this idea of what that would actually look like for informal workers. Okay, so first of all, though, who are these workers, and where do they live? What are they doing? Well, they're everywhere. So by recent ILO and WIAGO statistics, we actually know that there are more than 2 billion workers globally who are working informally. And then actually, if we step back and look, this is 61% of all workers. So this is a huge group, right, that are struggling without regulation, without the kind of standards and benefits and protections that we might think of when we consider kind of a traditional employment relationship, right, or a labor employment relationship. So what I'd like to do for the rest of my time is to draw from 3 case studies from my field research. So I'm a qualitative researcher trained in ethnography, feminist methodologies, in-depth interviewing, survey design. And so using those different methodologies, I'd like to bring some examples from these particular case studies. So the first looks at a worker center in San Francisco. And this is an interesting place because this worker center actually brings together domestic workers and day laborers kind of organized under the same roof. But what I'll sort of show is that, in fact, deep kind of gender divisions actually structure really different job outcomes for these workers, including the amount of jobs that they get and the actual wages that they earn. The second group that I'll talk through is a group of food delivery workers who formed a collective in Mexico City called Ni un repartidor menos. And this is a group that has been active prior to the pandemic, but since the pandemic has really been at the center of a lot of broader transnational worker organizing of platform labor employees or workers. So this is a really exciting kind of group to examine what this categorization means when workers are excluded from the traditional kind of terms of employment, but in fact have mobilized and have really come together, especially around such a dangerous and kind of difficult job. The third group, bringing it a bit more local to me, is looking at domestic workers in Philadelphia who recently won the Philadelphia Domestic Worker Bill of Rights. It's very interesting, though. It's only applies to zip codes in Philadelphia, so it doesn't actually extend across the entire state. But these workers won this law during the pandemic, right? In the midst of huge job loss and other kind of fallout from the pandemic. So I'll be talking a little bit about a survey that we're doing right now that we're running this summer in order to actually understand what wage theft looks like for these workers and some other issues around kind of their return to work in the pandemic. Okay, so just to sort of move through these brief cases and just to sort of, again, think about bringing this racialized and gendered kind of framework of analysis and the kind of origin stories of how these workers came to be understood in such marginal ways and ways that they've responded and mobilized. I'll just give kind of a brief sense of what worker centers have been doing in the US. We know for day laborers especially, they've been growing in popularity and density really across the US for the past several decades. So for many undocumented migrant workers who lack these formal labor protections and often struggle with precarity, worker centers can provide an actual space, a kind of shelter, but they can also help these workers to secure employment, attend rights trainings, have kind of legal and political advocacy, and in a broader sense to create community, right? So they've really played a central role in a number of immigrant workers' lives, and they've continued to have a bigger role within the US labor movement itself, right? But what I found in my research with day laborers and domestic workers in San Francisco was that what we sort of know about the literature that's out there, it really emphasizes the kind of unity and the coming togetherness of workers through worker centers. And what I actually saw there was that gender often kind of became more of a divisive tool, and actually kind of kept these workers fragmented and really apart from each other in a certain way, and kind of divided these workers. So given that worker centers shape workers' access to employment, I ask, what role does gender really play in looking at the relationships between these day laborers and domestic workers? So this image actually comes from Domestic Workers United, which is in New York, not San Francisco. But what I saw in this research was that the women, the domestic workers here, were highly mobilized, kind of like this, this banner portrays. They were very connected together. They would go out and flyer for their jobs. And they were actually securing more work for themselves at higher wages than were the men. And so what I sort of ended up arguing here is that this idea is that gender affects these particular structural realities that each collective, the day laborers and the domestic workers, are facing. So we can consider this kind of nested ecology of the realities that the membership faces based on structural precarity. So men, for instance, are dealing with housing precarity. They're often homeless. They have a lot of kind of surveillance from ICE and police presence on the streets. Among these differing labor market dynamics is sort of this other layer of this nested ecology where women have an easier time securing positions. They also have the chance to have kind of a longer term relationship with their employers and a more kind of permanent connection, whereas men were often called to do much more kind of erratic, spontaneous sorts of tasks that would not lead to this higher kind of sense of more permanent employment. And then this final point about the kind of organizational space of the worker center itself. So just to break this down a little bit more, there's kind of a lot of information here, but if we really kind of hone in on this idea of the labor market dynamics, so women were actually earning more than the men at the time of my research. They were earning $60 for the first 3 hours of their employment, and then $15 per each hour afterwards, whereas men would only earn $15 per hour, and then an additional $15. Those prices have gone up now. So women now charge about $80 for the minimum time of 3 hours of work, plus an additional 20 hours. And that's sort of reflected, as you can see, the women would pay more in dues per month. The men only paid very little in terms of their dues. But in fact, this idea is that this kind of, this gender division of the work that they were doing actually created a lot of hostility within the worker center itself and led to a number of situations of sexual harassment. And this has really pushed this particular worker center and others to employ important kind of gender justice trainings, right? To really recognize the fact that these workers do share so much and there's so much to actually unify them. But in fact, this kind of popular education work, right, is something that really needs to be done, especially around kind of gender justice issues here that we see. So I'll just move on quickly to thinking about this next case study looking at food delivery workers. So this scene comes from a really terrible moment when Jose Matias was killed by a garbage truck. This is in Mexico City on November 27, 2018. At the time, he was performing his first bike delivery, so on his bike with his backpack for Uber Eats. He was also working for Rappi, the Colombian platform company, at the same time, but both companies refused to provide any kind of compensation to his family for his death. So in the midst of Matias's passing, this collective was formed, Ni un reparto menos. And again, as I was mentioning, they've since kind of become a very unified part and leader in this kind of global platform workers organizing movement, which is really exciting. But again, this is pre-pandemic. So if we actually just jump to this next slide, this photo, if you can see, is Ni un reparto menos, the group. And to the right, you see this white bike. This was from another fellow member of the collective, Jimena, who was only 19, who was killed while delivering, who was killed by a beverage truck when she was cycling with her bag. So workers were already facing these incredibly dangerous situations, and due to their independent contractor status, there was virtually no kind of recourse or recompense from these companies. But what we did see, of course, during the pandemic is that these workers became even more central or essential, right? Of course, as the kind of key term that we've thrown around, during these lockdowns, right? When cities were shut down, the workers were the lifeline for medicine, for food, for different supplies, not only in Mexico City, of course, but really globally. And of course, the only thing that we actually see has happened is that sort of both areas that are challenging around this job, or both aspects, have continued, right? Not only kind of dangerous cycling conditions, also being prone to sexual assault, which many of the women writers talked about. But then with the pandemic, of course, much more exposure to the virus, worries about transmission, and this kind of lingering technological control over the work itself. So just to sort of explore what this means in terms of these workers not accessing, minimum wages or any kind of just wages, we can turn to the Economic Policy Institute just to get kind of a sense of the rundown here of these differences, right? What this sort of looks like if you cannot qualify for this employee status. And I think this is an important, something important to show, because this looks like a very kind of US informed statistic, but actually this applies to a number of countries similar to sort of Mexican labor law, right? So has very similar language around who's qualified as an independent contractor versus an employee, and then the significant host of benefits that that excludes workers from when they're doing this kind of dangerous essential work. And so in one of our interviews, a food delivery worker talked about this point, both kind of the employment relationship that they have with the company, and then the power of that kind of algorithmic control over the labor process for when and how they work. So just to quote this here, this worker said, "The truth is you really work for them. You're an employee 100%. In fact, based on the ranking system and acceptance rate they use, you must go online at a specific time of the day and for a minimum amount of hours, or else they disconnect you and you can even lose your job," right? So we clearly kind of see the power that these platform companies have, yet even in the midst of, the death of riders, right? They are kind of nowhere to be found. So I think it's exciting to consider what workers have done in the midst of the pandemic and really coming together with other independent contractors from other countries, and to really make this push to say, hey, we are workers deserving of these wages. And they've actually had success in certain parts of Europe, and a few moments of success across Latin America, which is exciting. So I'll just briefly now turn to my last quick case study, coming back a bit more locally, thinking about what's going on in Philadelphia. Again, thinking of domestic workers who, the majority of them, there are roughly around 16,000 in the Philadelphia area. This is mostly a group of undocumented women of color. It's sometimes difficult to get data on these workers specifically. There's also, for instance, a large group of Ukrainian and kind of Eastern European workers in the city. But in terms of the real organizing here, this is actually a chapter of the National Domestic Worker Alliance. This is the PA chapter. Many of these women are Afro-Latinx or Afro-Latina and Latinx workers. And again, this has this kind of long origin story, right, of extending this particular industry, extending from early, the institution of slavery, right, which is something that has continued to affect, these wages. So to the point about this law, this was a super exciting moment. This actually went into effect on May Day of this year, 2021. But of course, it went into effect amid a pandemic. And this had already been a really challenging time for domestic workers who were kind of fired, the kind of mass exodus of workers, especially in March of 2020, April of 2020, right, with other employer families kind of staying at home, and also dealing with kind of deep fears around contamination and transmission. But what we see here, and this is what we actually try to address in the survey that I'm creating as part of that LRAN grant, the New Labor Scholar Grant, is that there's kind of this deeper story about employer control going on, right? So employers might sort of say, you can keep working for me once a week, but I'm really uncomfortable with you working for other families, or, trying to curtail domestic workers' activities outside of the employer's home and their workspace, right? So this deeper kind of issue around having control around kind of those workers' lives and livelihoods during the pandemic. Another point about this idea of most of these women also being undocumented workers, right, is that, of course, they didn't qualify for any of the stimulus relief packages. So this was, again, kind of a deep reckoning or a very complicated time for domestic workers kind of globally. Of course, we see the same thing happening across Latin America, but in Philadelphia, kind of honing in on this moment with the law, and then also, in the midst of the pandemic. But an interesting kind of, if we just actually considering the law itself, it set this, what they call the gold standard for domestic worker protections. And this newspaper article says, if you're looking for ways your city can help undo the legacy of slavery in the US, consider starting with protections for domestic workers, right? So really hearkening to New Deal era legislation and the deeply kind of racist, discriminatory origins of what these laws were saying, and kind of the legacies that they have continued, right, in terms of these marginalized workers. So what the law really tries to do is actually, it does instill written contracts, which is huge. If we go back to that point about the will of the more powerful, having a written contract, right, is sort of a huge part of, of that power imbalance, right, of trying to sort of even that out or recognize that power imbalance in a certain way. It also gives these important paid time off. It gives meal breaks, rest breaks, things that workers really, had never actually had written into law before. But of course, based on this idea of when this happened, right, the Philadelphia Inquirer, Broken Philly says, well, this takes effect as they're losing jobs in droves. So workers have really been struggling in Philadelphia. And so what we're trying to do now with the survey is we're kind of launching a survey blitz that we presented to the Philadelphia, the City Hall Task Force last week and the Department of Labor. And what we're actually trying to look at here is to get to the heart of these questions around, what are the actual baseline wages that workers are earning? Is it per house? Is it per task? Is it per hour? So different ways of measuring wages, right, that also can sort of lead to wage theft. And this usually isn't so sort of obvious when employers just sort of don't pay up. That also happens, but it generally sort of sneaks in when workers have to start doing more and more and more tasks with their time that they're not being reimbursed for. So this is something that we're trying to sort of look at here. We also just want to establish a baseline around what those wages are that could then potentially be launched into either a legislative or a non-legislative campaign in the future. So this is something exciting, I think, that workers have been involved in. And the idea is that we're going to do a survey training, a sort of a participatory worker survey training over a few days, and get certain worker leaders trained up to then administer the survey more broadly throughout the city. And then hopefully kind of reach more of these groups of workers who were not formally organized into the National Domestic Worker Alliance, the PA chapter. So I think I'm nearing time. I just will stop here, but hopefully just these little snippets of these case studies show us that, in order to really think about what a just wage means for such informal workers, we have to, confront and understand a gendered and racialized framework of analysis here, and what that can then give us and kind of show us about that deep lingering informality and these legacies of injustice that have continued to surround workers' wages and their lives in the informal economy. So thanks so much. I'll stop there, and I look forward to hearing the next presentation.
Great. Thanks so much, Kate. Look forward to discussing your findings and talking more after our next presentation. Our next speakers are Pat Regan and Marty Whalen, respectively the president and co-owner of Crossroads Solar, a local solar panel manufacturing company whose core mission is to create good-paying jobs with benefits for people transitioning from prison back to society. Regan has a Ph.D. from the University of Michigan and has held faculty positions at the University of Canterbury, Binghamton University, and the University of Notre Dame. An associate director of Notre Dame's Environmental Change Initiative for Indie Gain, the Notre Dame Global Adaptation Initiative, a university effort seeking to understand the effects of climate change through a lens of human social adaptation, and to advise private industry and non-governmental organizations developing adaptation strategies. Regan has authored 5 books and over 60 articles. He left the University of Notre Dame in August of 2019 to start Crossroads Solar. His partner, Marty Whalen, and we're fortunate to have both of them with us today, graduated from Notre Dame with a degree in sociology. and then received an M.B.A. from Olivet Nazarene University. He ran a small business and has been on the boards of a local hospital, community bank, United Way, and community foundation. He's involved with the Moreau College Initiative, a college in prison program at Westville Correctional Facility in Indiana. I'm grateful to be a part of that. I don't know what happened there, but we'll continue. Marty also currently serves as the career program manager for Notre Dame's College of Arts and Letters. So we're grateful to have both Pat and Marty, and they've asked me to start with a video, and it's a short video introducing Crossroads Solar. I'm going to see if I can pull this off right now.
Crossroads is a solar panel manufacturing company. I started the idea probably 4 years ago. I was a professor at Notre Dame teaching in the Westville prison for a Notre Dame Holy Cross program. And one of the students said to me, "Problem is, Professor, your people won't hire me. These people come out of prison. They've done colossally bad things sometimes. And then the world that we live in won't hire them. So they never get another chance to make it right. So they're always an ex-felon." So I thought, well, I could probably do something about that.
One of the hardest things getting out of prison is falling back into your old ways. Especially in my situation, I'm a recovering drug addict. So if you want to create a new life and a new avenue and be able to be a good citizen, you have to work and you have to continue to pay your bills and grow from there.
That's what's good about this place, because they actually hire ex-felons, and it gives somebody a good opportunity to prove yourself.
It works out really great because this is a team environment and it makes you feel like you're productive and you're helping in something that you would have never been able to before.
We're not in this to sell the company and make a lot of money. We're in it to create some opportunity and actually make a viable business and compete in the marketplace that's out there, and yet be fair to the employees that are here.
All right, and with that, I'll turn it over to, I think, first Pat and then Marty. They'll collaborate for the next 20 minutes or so.
Yeah, we'll do some version of a dog and pony show. Thank you for the opportunity, and thanks, Kate, for your comments. We're going to both respond to point number 7, or issue number 7 was pretty relevant to us over the last couple of weeks. So it's very prescient at this time. We'll talk about that in a minute. But we're going to present something of a practical application of the idea of just wage. We're going to frame it in terms of a living wage because we have some conceptual issues with the just wage, and we can talk about these in the Q&A. But they just come out in terms of what is decent and all that kind of stuff, and how you evaluate the relationship between the individual and the family. Q&A, we're happy to have those discussions. At least to my mind, the idea of a just wage, living wage, has some silent foundations that are tied to some theoretical roots of the labor theory of value and alienation that really come out of Marx. We don't talk about it very much anymore, but labor is the input for production and profit is a mechanism for alienation, and self-worth and dignity are tied to alienation. So the just and living wage concepts has something of this at its foundation, I think. But importantly, so does Crossroads Solar. This is why Crossroads Solar exists, and we're going to really describe for you folks how we created Crossroads as a social enterprise embedded in a market system. And functionally, it's an experiment. And we are in the midst of experimenting whether you can start a company from scratch that takes these core concepts into consideration. So the core objective of Crossroads is to create an industry or a manufacturing facility within an industry that provides good jobs with benefits to reintegrating felons in this. And to my mind, and I'm certain Marty would agree with this, but his mic is on and he could jump in. Crossroads would not exist without this operating principle at its core. I never once woke up and saw myself as, oh, start your video. My video is started.
You're on.
Oh,
We
I'm
can
not,
see you.
okay.
Now we can
Okay.
see you.
Oh, you can't see me now. Oh, I'm looking at, I get it. I'm looking at slides. So I get it. You just look at Marty for a while. How about that? So I never woke up thinking that I wanted to be across a solar panel manufacturing company. And I'm going to just do something different so you could see me, and I'll do slides in a different orientation. We Marty and I met, and okay, now you're going to see me? Yes?
Got you. Yes.
Okay. Marty and I discussed making solar panels as a way to develop this core principle of how we would be able to create jobs and opportunities for men and women reintegrating out of prison. And to, I think, our way of thinking, recently released felons are some of the most alienated people in human society. You could throw a lot of other people into this category: LGBTQ folks, maybe domestic workers, maybe people of color, but systematically released felons, they have few resources, they have few opportunities for work, they have high recidivism rates and high rates of homelessness. And so Marty and I developed Crossroads Solar to try and tackle some of these things. So when we were thinking about this presentation, I asked myself, well, how would you describe a felon? And if you went down the street and asked your neighbor, asked your mother, or asked your partner, whoever you ask, you'll often come up with the description of a felon as a bum, a criminal, a scourge, a threat, an opportunityless person, a neglected, scared, low wage, whatever those adjectives are. They're probably the modal definition in society. But there are alternative definitions of ex-felons that I think Marty and I subscribe to. They're at the core of Crossroads Solar. And those would include human, smart, thoughtful, and motivated. But even with an education, these folks struggle in our society, that we tend to never let them back in the game. So Crossroads Solar is about doing it. So it's a solar panel manufacturing facility, and I'll talk about it in a minute. It's a model that might work. And if it does work, it could be applicable to nearly any industry that you could think of. And there are other industries out there that target second chance citizens, and they run from bakeries to donut shops to hot dog stands to soap makers and other things. What we're doing is manufacturing a cutting edge product with contemporary technology that will pay good wages with benefits if it is profitable. And I always put profit in quotes because the term sometimes gets to me. We're going to share the profits with our employees. And after Marty and I make the company stable, we're going to find a way to transfer it to the employees that are there. So Marty and I aren't in this to grow a business, sell it, and walk away with a lot of money. We're interested in trying to implement a model or an experiment to see if we can work that develops this social enterprise in a way that's viable and is replicable. Okay. A little bit about the business that we've taken on. It's a business that's largely driven by large manufacturers. Most of them are offshore, but that's changing, in part because of tariffs and things like that. The business is sensitive, and just let me put what large and small is. That we will make about 6 megawatts of power output in a year. Maybe the next smallest company that you might know might make 250 megawatts of power in a year. So 40 times our size. The business is priced at the unit of a watt. And a watt, one cell puts out 5.5 watts. We have one panel produces 380 watts. So it's a very price sensitive business, and it's sensitive at that level of a watt. So a half a cent a watt turns into a significant amount of money in a panel, and turns into actually a quite large amount of money if your array is big. Utility scale, for example, would be a way to do that. The industry, to my mind, is overloaded with executives at the expense of workers. It's mostly pushing towards full automation. We have partially automated production facilities. The industry describes this as minimizing the human touch. Well, we're interested in hiring people and giving opportunities. So we use automation when it's necessary and human touch when it's possible to make the same quality panel that others make at a price point that's competitive with everybody. We emphasize workers, we minimize the management. We're finding out, and apropos point 7 of this, that sometimes management has some value to it that I'm just finding out, and we'll get to that. Crossroads as a business has to find a way to compete in this very competitive production space. Some of our value, and I mean in the sense of we have to be profitable. We have to make enough money to sustain ourselves. And we have to do that in an industry that's very tight on margins and very large in production. So some of our value that we add is in our story, but our story alone won't make us competitive and sustainable. We have to make a damn good product, and we have to make it at a price point that's competitive so that we can sell our story. But our story is important to us. We have to pay wages that are at the upper bound of contemporary manufacturing, at least in our community. And we have to provide meaningful work experience to generate meaningful social integration. And this last part is really what we're after. So if we want the people coming out of prison to have a chance at housing and life as we know it and not go back to prison, then we have to provide the things that allow that to happen, and they have to provide for us labor that helps us move the project forward. As a business model, we have workers, but not what you might think of as administrators. The core, and it is a task, mind you, I might slip by this kind of easily, but it's not easy. The accountant, the bookkeeper, the scheduler, the supply chain manager, sales, and production all have to come out of the prison population if possible. So we will be training, reintegrating felons to take on these tasks. And we will train those with acumen for administration along with production. Marty is in the process. I never sold a thing in my life, and Marty's giving me tips on how you sell something. At the end of the day, we have to get, not me to be a good salesperson, but we got to get some of our workers to be good salespeople. If any of you are old enough to remember the People's Express model, that airline that changed the whole air industry with low cost budget flying, People's Express was a very flat hierarchical structure where the CEO would be a flight attendant sometimes. And that's kind of how we are. We're, low budget, high quality, high motivation. I'm doing that 2 things. So here's what we're doing with regard to wages and worker involvement, so to speak. We have a target wage of $17.50 an hour. We will start with a probationary wage at $16 an hour, because sometimes some of the people we get coming out of prison don't care anything about Crossroads Solar, only about $16 an hour, and only for those few days. We want to get the ones who will go with us for the ride and maybe be the owners of the company. So we'll use the probationary period to evaluate, and there's a lot of people coming out of prison, so we're not always lacking for a pool of people, but we'll move them quickly to scale. So we're paying the workers $17.50 an hour. The president of the company, which is me, makes $19.50 an hour. So we have a very flat income scale. Because profit, so to speak, is not our primary goal, sustainability can be in the efficiency that we do. So some of our efficiency is in production, some of our efficiency is in the organizational structure of the company itself. Price competition in the market's partially a function of the upper salaries. And the the CEO, the president, the vice president, the senior engineer, all the top end salaries, and then a bunch of machines run the floor, and that drives some of their pricing structure. But we don't have those upper salaries, but we also lack the purchasing power that the big companies do. But we have a lot of companies working for us to try and make us competitive on purchasing. So we're getting a lot of help in all this kind of stuff. Our panels may be slightly more expensive. That remains to be seen. But to some degree, we can manipulate or use our ability to affect pricing structure to our advantage. We target 9 to 10 employees to start off, and we've been building panels for roughly a year now, but mostly in training and production of panels for certification, UL certification. We hopefully will start near the end of July for scaled production that will be permanent with 9 to 10 employees, 6 megawatts of production. 6 megawatts of production is not huge, but it's 16,000 panels per year, which turns out to be 60 a day. And that actually in our small facility is a task. One of the things we had to do, apropos point 7, is we could get to production of about 20 panels a day, and it was hard. As a political scientist coming into this, it was really hard. We hired recently a plant manager who has 2 Purdue engineering degrees, a bachelor's and a graduate, and an M.B.A., and he's got 20 years in prison. And we are paying him about 75% more than we're paying me. And we just needed that expertise, and it's worth paying it. We like to say we're going to make perfect panels with people who have made mistakes, and that includes me. We're going to market these panels through design install companies, but we have the ability to sell direct to the purchaser, the consumer itself. So we're in a position to start up production to scale with a facility that will bring, let's call it 10 people who have spent from years to decades incarcerated, back into the workforce, back into the society with an income that's not going to be at the top of the charts, but it's a good starting income with the potential for profit sharing and the potential for ownership. If we can do that, we're going to maximize on those 5 points of a living wage. And we're going to create a replicable model for nearly any industry. There's no rocket science in the industry that we've chosen. And we're going to be a company with social principles, focusing on the people, embedded in a market-based system that sometimes tends to avoid the people. And at the end of the day, every industry should love this model, because if we can do it, then any industry can do it, and it provides for a better, more stable social environment. And primarily Bernie Sanders would just love this stuff. So we'll leave it at that and take any questions at Q&A.
Pat, if I might just add, I had a couple of things that I wanted to tag on to what you said.
Yep.
Good job.
Yeah, Marty, you have 5 minutes. You've got plenty of time if you want to.
Oh, I don't have that much, Dan. I'm not an academic. I'm going to bring the high level down to like a copier salesman that I was.
You don't have to rush. Is all I mean.
Okay, I appreciate that. I just wanted to expand it on a couple of points, or maybe expand on them. So in business, profit sometimes is a dirty word, but it's not. I ran a business, and that is what raises all boats in the harbor, including the employees. And without it, we're not going to be a company that can hire employees at all. And so there's somebody coined the term the triple bottom line. So any MBA student has learned about the triple bottom line of profits, planet, and people, and it doesn't always go in that order, but ours is specifically in this order: people, planet, profits. And they're all important, But at the very heart, it's going to be interesting going on sales calls and explaining that we exist to employ people who will solder the ends of bus bars on solar panels. We could have bought a machine that would have automatically done that, but we didn't, because that's where we exist, or the platform that we exist is to employ people. And Pat, you said that, you talked about our living wage, or our $17.50, and that's actually gone up in the last year or so due to market situations around our area. But just to give the audience kind of a sense of relativity here, guys get out of the prison, they get either a bachelor's or a associate's degree through this Moreau College seminar, and then they end up working for $8.50 an hour at night cleaning offices with their college degree. So when we talk about $16 or $17 an hour, that's not an insignificant amount for these people. It's much less than we would like to pay them. And one of the things that people ask a lot is, are you a not-for-profit? Are you a 501c3? We're not, by design. We want to prove that this can be a going concern, and that the employees are one of the reasons that we do very well. These are bright, bright people. Pat's right about these being some of the most marginalized people. But when you actually go teach them, and I know Dan and Pat have had this experience as well as me, and get to know them, you realize, oh, these are pretty bright people that have made a mistake, sometimes a colossal mistake. But a lot of us have, and we just think that this is a wonderful opportunity. I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about something that piqued my interest in the number 7 criteria, and that's the notion of performance and evaluation. So I did run a business. I was fortunate enough to run a business. We grew it and we sold it to Xerox. We had about 125 employees. And I really don't think that performance gets the attention that it deserves in a business. So, and I've told Pat this, we have had a transitory workforce, but we're going to have 8 to 10 people that are going to be our full-time employees. And dealing with people is the hardest part of running a business in many cases. It was even for a small business. And that's because you really want to be fair to them. You really have to have an eye on profitability, and you have to understand the connection between performance of individuals, performance of the company, and that last P for us, which is profit. If we don't have the ducks in a row that we need to for performance, we're just not going to be good. Pat is a data scientist, and our first week that we made panels, I think I'll be real close. 47, I think we broke 47% of the cells that we touched. That is pitiful performance. When you think about every one of those being 80 cents, it costs us 80 cents. We wouldn't have been in business for very long, but we've gotten much better at that. And what I'd really like to talk about in this from a larger framework is the connection of good management and performance. And I think that managers and businesses in general don't put enough emphasis on evaluating and developing open and honest communication in order to make the employee excel at their jobs. Not every job is going to turn into a C-level job, but it doesn't mean that the person who's making $10 an hour couldn't make $13 an hour. And I think all too often a poor manager just shunts people along or gives them a performance evaluation that isn't doing them any disservice. It's kind of like getting it off my plate. And I think the evaluation part is difficult. I don't think people like confrontation always, but it can be done in a really constructive way. And high performing companies have high performance evaluation tools. And that just struck me as we're going to do it. We haven't started that yet, Pat, but that's going to be an important thing for us. Our guys will need to know when they need to improve and get patted on the back when they do a great job. So Dan, that's all I've got.
Great. Thanks so much, Pat and Marty. And looking forward to continuing this conversation, as well as hopefully getting a tour of Crossroads Solar soon, if you're willing to let me.
You're willing.
And now I'll ask Kate to join and Marty and Pat to stay on as I introduce our respondent, Stacia Reisinger. Stacia is a recent alum of the University of Notre Dame, where she graduated with honors with a degree in international economics and peace studies. As an undergraduate, Stacia was a central component of the Just Wage Initiative for the past 2 years, working as our primary research assistant over the past year. She'll spend the next year working in a postgraduate service role with a Mate House in Chicago, where she'll work as a legal assistant in the immigration department of the Greater Chicago Legal Clinic. Stacia intends to begin law school in the fall of 2022, where she hopes to focus on public interest law to address the legal vulnerabilities at the intersection of immigration and labor. I'll turn it now to Stacia and also thank her for all her work with the Just Wage Project over the last 2 years. And then she'll give some comments and then open with some questions, and then we'll just turn back to the three of you for hopefully a free-flowing conversation. Stacia, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And first of all, I just wanted to say how excited and grateful I am to be here today. Thank you to Pat, Marty, and Kate for everything you guys have already brought to the table. I'm going to speak a little bit about my past experience working with the Higgins Labor Program, and then we can hopefully get into some really good Q&A and continue this productive discussion. So when I reflect on the role of Criterion 7, it is impossible for me to separate this individual criterion from the overarching just wage framework. For example, as Kate emphasized, a truly just wage that considers performance, qualification, and the type of work being performed is inherently non-discriminatory, considering neither race, gender, nor any other factor irrelevant to the actual labor being performed. As a student here at Notre Dame, my primary major was economics, and there we were taught the theory of this magical natural rate of wages, which many of you have probably heard about, which is theoretically determined by a simple measure of supply and demand, the equilibrium of the price at which an employer is willing to pay for labor and that at which the employee is willing to sell their labor. Theoretically, this wage is informed by a lot of things. On the employer side, mostly the value that the labor being performed adds to the overall production process. And then on the employee side, considerations like what physical and psychological toll the work is taking, as well as the opportunity cost of giving up other ways of spending one's valuable time, including both alternative job opportunities and leisure with friends and family. So this, in theory, is supposed to account for competition within markets and employers fighting each other to seduce the best workers with generous wages and high benefits. So this is the simple equation upon which traditional economics relies to determine an appropriate level of wages. And this equation does inherently consider many of the criteria embodied in the just wage framework, including the ability of the wage any given worker is willing to accept to provide the highest possible standard of dignity, security, and life for oneself and one's family. Additionally, it would reward the most difficult, least sought after jobs with the best wages and benefits, which is really an important part of Criterion 7, since the potential supply of these laborers may be low relative to demand. However, even as a freshman taking principles of microeconomics, I saw that this theory of wages does not really match the real life context. I learned that much when I set out during high school to get a job, and everywhere I looked was paying the same rate, which was the Indiana and federal minimum wage of $7.25 per hour, no matter what job I was going to perform or how much I was willing and how hard I was willing to work. So what here is the field of economics missing? Among other factors, the equation ignores the important dynamic of power, which characterizes any employment relationship, as Kate pointed out in her presentation. And this factor ends up being incredibly important in the actual wages paid to employees, as testified to the case studies offered by Kate and the alternative model presented by Pat and Marty earlier today. Many jobs that are extremely important to society's functioning are paradoxically undervalued in the wage structure. And this phenomenon has been laid bare by the COVID-19 pandemic, which we are currently amidst. and the emergence of this new term as essential workers, which is often used as a euphemism to describe low-wage work in roles such as medical technicians, janitorial staff, service workers, and domestic workers. Along with this new determination comes television commercials from immensely profitable industry giants such as Walmart, Amazon, and Apple, where they praise the work of their workers and how important that work is to society without providing any additional material compensation for their labor. And the empty rhetoric fails to hide the basic fact that regardless of how essential the labor of these workers may be, many large employers see immediate benefits to cutting labor costs. While such employers simply wish to pay their workers as little as possible to maximize corporate profit, the Catholic social tradition, which I've been studying throughout my time at Notre Dame, and which I consider important in considering what a just wage may be, calls instead for a wage set by a transparent process that respects the humanity of workers by honoring their qualifications, which often come in the form of educational attainment, but also the interpersonal skills, empathy, and individual creativity brought by workers of diverse backgrounds. And in addition to these qualifications, the value they add to the production process in the workplace in general, and the type of work the workers are performing, which is often physically and or mentally demanding. And that is where the importance of Criterion 7 lies. This is what, in my view, the traditional economic theories lack: an understanding that a respect for the humanity of workers cannot be quantified, neatly factored into the optimization equations that are the bread and butter for many economists. And although this respect for the dignity of workers does contribute to businesses' productivity and sustainability, as Marty just pointed out, for many corporations, long-term sustainability is often less attractive than short-term gains. So that's probably enough undergraduate level economic theory for one day. I'd like to consider a concrete example that I've looked at throughout my time at Notre Dame, where as a student, I've done a lot of research and work centered on the rights of migrant laborers, specifically farm workers in Southwest Florida, and the often exploitative workplace relationships in which they toil. The physical demand of harvesting produce or working in a packing plant is punishing enough, but the mental impact of stretching low wages to provide food, shelter, healthcare, and education for their families creates an additional strain. Now, the undesirability of these jobs is further evidenced by the labor shortage in the agricultural industry, which has been contributed to by the Trump-era immigration crackdowns, which contributes to this labor shortage even during times with higher than usual levels of unemployment. However, the relatively smaller supply of labor in this field has not led to a higher natural rate of wages for many farm workers, who are often particularly vulnerable to exploitation due to an undocumented immigration status, an inability to speak English, and a subsequent limitation on the type of job he or she can perform, past criminal records, or simple geographical limitations. All this information leads us to a basic question, which I think we can comfortably address during this next portion. During a pandemic that has exacerbated existing institutional inefficiencies and inequalities, how can we work to improve the dynamic in which employees must accept paltry wages despite the importance of their work to the very foundations of our society? And how can we collaborate, as Pat and Marty are working to do, to innovate new models of management and the employer-employee relationship to ensure that the model of wages envisioned by CST, one that considers not only the profit motive, but also the full humanity of individual workers, is respected and represented in the compensation awarded for their time and labor. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to the conversation with our panelists, Kate, Marty, and Pat. I have some questions to start us off, and I'd like to remind you guys that we're inviting any participants to make use of the Q&A function to ask your own questions and contribute to this important conversation. So if any of the panelists first have any quick responses to that, and then we can maybe move on to more specific questions.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in if I could, Stacia. Thanks so much for those really excellent comments, kind of centering us and also, responding to your own experience, which is really exciting. Amate House is awesome, by the way. Congratulations. So your last comment there really made me think of Criterion 6, actually, right? I think the only way we can do that is as Naomi Williams and others were talking about in our last session, involving workers, right, and their voice and their participation. And so I think that's something, the brief survey that I mentioned that we're really trying to do is to actually get to the heart of, domestic workers' experience in the city and, what it's meant for them during the pandemic. And then also what this new law, what the possibilities could hold legislatively. And then sort of with that baseline understanding, what types of campaigns can maybe come from that knowledge and of that experience. So that's just kind of a quick response to the kind of last question you were throwing out, which I really like. So thanks.
Marty or Pat, anything at this moment?
I will just speak disparagingly for a moment about economists and economic theory of wages and whatnot. Since none of us here are economists, that's probably fair. I think it's, I think that's right, yes. It's rather odd to have economists talk about wage theory and such things when it's certainly in the academy, an economist will make 2x whatever anybody else will make in the academy for the given level of appointment. And they will justify it based on supply and demand in the marketplace. Even though education would be the same, productivity might not even be the same, it might be lower, but they'll say, oh, we demand 2x because we are economists. Same is true in the business school, mind you. And so for, now I'm just bashing economists. I don't know why I'm bashing economists, but I'll leave it at that.
Marty, any thoughts before we go back to Stacia?
Now, why don't we take the questions?
Go ahead, Stacia.
Awesome. Yeah. And just for the record, I've had a lot of great economics professors, not to disparage the whole profession, but yeah, I think that the theory of wages can be a little bit misleading, especially at the undergraduate level, where it's less of the complicated analysis and more of the theoretical supply and demand. So yeah, one of the first questions I had was directed toward Kate. And you mentioned this connection with the sixth criterion on the participation of workers. And I liked that your presentation emphasized that a lot. And the importance of the participation of workers through collective action to fight for their rights and higher wages. And I was wondering if, in your view, there is a tension between workers' needs to work toward a higher standard of living in the short term, while also advocating for the institutional change needed to improve standards in the long term. Because I think a lot of what I've been considering is this kind of short-term, long-term, this idea of short-term profits over long-term sustainability and that kind of model that prevails in a lot of labor markets. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks, Stacia. I'm not necessarily convinced that there has to be a tension, as more maybe I might think of this as like a division of labor, right? Just sort of how I think about everything. So like what the role is of these bigger, broader sectoral networks that informal workers are part of, right? Maybe that's sort of where that push for kind of broader, longer term institutional change is happening, right? But kind of the work that these workers are doing on the ground, I think, is very much rooted, in their own sense of pushing for, worker justice in their daily lives and collective action and raising their voices. So I don't know if it's necessarily a tension or sort of part of how to understand a bigger movement, one that's kind of fluid and changing, right? And I'm generalizing here, right? Because these are very different kind of worker groups, but I think about like the International Domestic Worker Federation or the US-based sectoral network for day laborers, right? And then this newly formed global network of platform delivery workers, right? So they all have very different aims in some ways, but I think it's sort of about the division of labor and where they can sort of successfully try to target sources of power and mobilization. Thanks.
Stacia, you want to ask one more from your list? And then I have a couple from the group chat that I'll follow up with.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I wanted to kind of connect both the presentations we saw was when we think about this criterion, one of the things that comes first to my mind is the need to have kind of standardized and transparent processes to set wages. And I'm really interested, Dr. Graff and I actually talked about this morning, but Marty and Pat, as you are kind of setting up all of these new structures in your experimental model at Crossroads Solar, and you're kind of in this new position of creating a brand new set of labor policies at your business. What factors are most important to you when considering setting wage rates, the processes for setting raises, and so on?
Yeah, maybe I'll start on this one, Pat.
Good for you.
Okay. So Pat and I made an odd couple starting this business, because I come from business and Pat comes from the academy a little bit. And so I'll just give you one example. At the very beginning, Pat wanted to pay a very good living wage. And I said, whoa, time out. Let's pay a wage that we can raise up as performance starts to become a little better. I believe that, that's a way to show a little love to employees. They kind of expect it over time. And so that's just an example of how we've been kind of talking this through. And we're leaning heavily on the Notre Dame Legal Clinic actually has done some third-year law students have worked with us to develop our employee handbook. So the wage framework is coming a little bit from the market, but also from our mission and the way we're going to treat workers, because we'll have a little bit of a different worker than the average business. And so we want to have a compassionate employee handbook, yet put in guardrails to make sure that we run a business as a business. So it's a little tricky. I think that we're gonna probably end up course correcting a lot on a number of things. But just from my experience, if wages are like ratchets; they don't go backwards. So if you start high and then we're unprofitable, and we go to our workforce and say, hey, you know what? We're going to cut you $2 an hour. That is not a good way to, in my opinion, to go. We always want to give ourselves a little bit of room. And from running a business, I'll tell you, and I just made this point to Pat the other day, to have a little cushion is wise because something always comes up. You can just imagine the supply chain issues we've had in the last year of just getting our raw materials to make these. Had we set anything in stone a year ago, it would be disastrous for where we are now. Pat?
Yeah, I think Marty's right. Before Marty got involved, I had a business plan drawn up for Crossroads Solar, and I had a dean of a business school in New York gave me two final year M.B.A. students did this as their capstone project. And I went out there once and they said, we can't get this to be profitable. So I went off on a tirade of what profit means to them. That is that last zero, or is that last number, is it zero a red number or a black number? And they were befuddled, and I talked to them about profit being in people and whatnot. So I said, just get zero to be black and I'll be good. and that was just paying as much as, just pay everything out and all that. And Marty, I think rightly, in hindsight, it was, to me, it was maybe a way to give the work and the dignity, and just, if you got to nothing at the end, that was a pretty good deal for me. So
Great, thanks.
That's how we said it.
All right, I'll ask a question first to Kate and then another to Marty and Patrick. So Kate, just responding to the last comment and Stacey's comments about the complexity here, and I think your presentation was all about, these are complex things. When we try to simplify labor markets into supply and demand abstractions, or even on the other hand, say we're going to prioritize people over profits, we learn how messy the reality is. So our just wage framework, we've tried to present in a holistic, qualitative, interconnected way, not allowing people to separate out the criteria or simply produce a number, whether that's a dollar or a point system. That's frustrated a lot of people, but to us, that's one of the virtues, is is it creates conversation. And I'm curious if you think that, originally, based on the presentation, I was going to say, is there a way that we should be making gender more central to the just wage framework? Maybe you could say gender and race more central rather than its criterion for non-discrimination, which is a negative word. But we want to think in terms of inclusion, and I'm wondering if, rooted in your own perspective and work, if we're not giving enough attention, or if there's ways to make those issues more central, or foreground them that recognize more the reality of labor markets. You could say the same thing about classification of workers, maybe. If you say 60% of all workers are informal, I don't know, maybe the just wage framework doesn't capture that because it presumes stable employee-employer relations. So I guess I'm asking you to maybe, inviting you to comment on the limitations of our framework. That might be hard to do.
I mean, I think we can never talk about gender and race enough, so I'm happy that was the prompt. I like kind of what you're saying, because that was one of my first initial reactions about like the premise of where we start with employment, right? And so that's why I wanted to show those numbers, just to remind us that, we're not talking about like a small group of people in the global South, right? This is actually, the informal economy is a huge part of the US economy and other like very wealthy, advanced global North countries, right? And their economies. So I like the idea of not only kind of like trying to maybe decenter this more traditional notion of employment relations, but this is something I do in my own field, right? And IR, ILR, LER is to sort of just bring informal workers into the conversation and sort of ask what that makes us reconsider. I also would hesitate to, be also important to mention that gender and race is hugely important for recognizing, issues of inequality in more traditional employment relationships as well. But so in terms of the criterion, I think it would be really interesting to think about what it would mean to bring those two in, and not in that sort of like negating way about non-discrimination, but in fact saying, that's part of how we understand intersectional solidarity, which is something that I'm sort of always tried to think about, in my own research and in the examples of these workers organizing and overcoming kind of incredible challenges, right? Legally and otherwise. The misclassification issue, I think maybe not. I think like that remains so important and sort of political and changing, right? Like what the PRO Act can do and what we see sort of. I think that's sort of a different line of thinking, but the fact that gender and race could be more central is something I'd be interested in pursuing. Thanks, Dan.
All right, thanks. We'll talk more about that. Okay, here's a couple. I'll combine a couple questions from the Q&A for Patrick and Marty primarily. The first, you mentioned employee ownership being a goal. Did you consider incorporating as a worker cooperative? What are your thoughts about the way you chose to incorporate and run as a business versus more of a democratic ownership model? If your experiment is successful, have you considered transitioning, whoops, I lost it, transitioning to a work or cooperative in the future? A related question to that is, would you consider turnover / transitioning your workers to other companies at higher wages a success or a failure of the company? So I think those are related, if either of you want to broach that question of structure and your place in the larger labor market and economy.
I think the answer to the last one is unequivocally yes. And we have had this conversation many times, that this doesn't have to be everybody's last job. It's the first job is the hard one for them to get. So if we bring people in and they move up and that requires moving out, go for it. That to me is a plus for Crossroads, even though we lose. It's a plus for the project, not necessarily for Crossroads. A workers cooperative, no, I don't think that we had those discussions. We talked about incorporating as a nonprofit, and that may or may not be a comparable thing. But we wanted to, fundamentally, we wanted to compete in the marketplace for the solar industry. And the minute we could get our panels competitive by getting a $100,000 grant from the government to make solar panels with prisoners or ex-prisoners, then we're not really competing in that market space. So, there are other companies that work exclusively with reintegrating felons who do incorporate as nonprofits. And they have grant writers on staff who are just writing grants because the soap they make can't be competitive with the wage structure that they have. So, we don't have a plan, and I think Marty will maybe better to speak this. We don't have a plan for the transition yet, in part because it's debt laden, and if we transitioned it, we'd just be giving them bad baggage. So we have to get it stable first, and how we figure out that transition is a future project.
Yeah, I personally, I suppose it's coming from owning a business. I'm just not that familiar, and it would scare me a little bit to have a democratically controlled business. And I'm admitting that, and I know it's probably not a popular thing to say on this forum, but I will tell you this. Pat and I have talked about that it's important that the guys get a living wage. And as Pat just said, we look at it as a stepping stone to maybe something much bigger. I mean, for some of these guys to get their first job under their belt, get stable, find housing, have something where they can progress a little bit, and then go find a job where that pays $60,000 or $70,000. We would consider that an unmitigated success. We hope to be there someday to be paying those kind of wages. One thing we have talked about is being transparent and using our business as an educational opportunity for our employees, and even to the point of having our accountant come in on a monthly or quarterly basis, opening up our books to show what profit means. And so we can tie productivity to profitability, and why it's important that they show up every day, and just things like that. We've got some people that have never been in the traditional workforce. I think Kate called it the informal workforce. We've got a guy, I forget, Pat, but he's 50 years old and he's never had a W-2 in his life. And when he came to us, Pat said, "Why do you want to work for us?" He said, "I've got a bunch of boys at home. I want them to see their father going to work and doing that." Well, that's great, but he didn't show up after a week of us training him. And it turned out his mother died from COVID. And nobody had ever taught him that you call in when you're not going to be coming in. So we have some, very basic work things that we're going to have to teach. But we'd like to get to the point where we may not have democratic ownership, but we have everybody pulling on the rope in the same direction and understanding why.
Marty, it was Walter Reuther in 1946, president of the United Auto Workers, when the UAW struck General Motors and said, "You can afford a 30% raise in wages without increasing the price of cars 1 cent. And you need to open the books so I can prove that you're raking in the profits during the war." He lost that battle. You're carrying on that struggle, even if you claim you're not pushing for complete democratic.
I'm glad to know that I'm
Here's another question for Kate. It's related to, I guess, the relationship between standards and regulations and reality. So it seems like great wins that Philadelphia domestic workers get a worker bill of rights, right? We're pushing for more regulation to standardize some of these informal sectors in order to give workers protections, to create a wage floor that doesn't benefit the chiselers who don't want to pay, and then it undercuts the businesses willing to pay and wanting to do so. But at the same time, we're getting some victories there. It seems like there's an overall trend toward less enforcement of existing laws in the US, whether it's OSHA or the Department of Labor's wage enforcement, whether it's the IRS and tax audits, right? So I'm wondering about the tension there between the sort of these creating and increasing standards versus whether that translates into actual changes on the job. And a related question from the Q&A, Tim Beatty, our good friend at the Teamsters Union in DC, says Mexico has just passed legislation regulating outsourcing, and he's wondering if this will lead to more platform-based delivery workers becoming employees. So I'm not familiar with that legislative change, but I guess that's a part of that sort of question about standards and regulations, if you could speak to.
Yeah, thanks. No, this is great. I mean, I think if we look just at the case of maybe domestic workers, considering sort of these long-term exclusions, right, from the Fair Labor Standards Act, what a lot of cities or states in the US have had to do, right, is to try to kind of come up with their own solution. So for instance, what Seattle did, right, was one of the most progressive laws we've seen to date, which kind of includes the standards board. So domestic workers have a real voice. It's a place where they can bring forward issues around sexual harassment complaints or other sorts of issues that need to actually be kind of considered, and that's kind of written into the law, right? What Philadelphia tried to do was have kind of a portable benefit system. So there's a lot of kind of creative, sorry, I got distracted by the going live thing in the chat. There's a lot of kind of creative responses, I think, to this issue around, you know, either a lack of regulation and what space that can open up, right? And I think it's exciting to see these kind of different state level or citywide kind of movements for domestic workers that can actually sort of show what works and what doesn't, right? And then each state kind of builds upon what the others have done. Of course, I think it'd be better if we had the national, you know, a national law. But your point, I think, is true too about just what that enforcement looks like kind of on the ground and in daily life. And I think that's why, you know, employers have a role in this too. And that's something that the group Hand in Hand, if anyone's familiar with that, has really, you know, brought together domestic worker employers to have a voice in this conversation. And something they're doing right now in Philly is trying to get employers to understand it's part of their job to actually educate workers about the bill, right? It's not, the onus isn't sort of on workers to tell their employers, you know, they have to start following these standards. It's sort of the other way around, which I think points to that idea of the kind of will of the more powerful. So thanks for the question. Oh, in terms of the Mexico, yeah, I'm not actually familiar with that legislation as well, but I'm curious to see the kind of impact that it may bring forward as well, especially for platform labor. So thanks for that question, Ted.
Yeah, and I'll connect you, Kate, with Tim, who raised that question. You two should know each other anyway. So I'll send a joint intro email. And I'll ask Stacia, we have time for one more. So Stacia, do you want to ask one more question?
Yeah, absolutely. One of them I thought was very interesting in the chat, and I think it's connected to this criterion specifically, but also to the overall framework in which it is embedded. So the question is, how does the criterion make space for workers with disabilities? And this particular questioner is thinking of the sub-minimum wage and its impacts.
Any of the three of our presenters have any thoughts on that? It's a big question that often people like me don't know a whole lot about. It's a good one.
I will try. This is just throwing out the Hail Mary, so to speak, but we're at Notre Dame and that works there. It seems like all of just wage theory is a challenge to contemporary supply and demand of labor type argument. And I think what we've heard from Kate, and certainly what Crossroads Solar is about, and this might be true with people with disability, is that not all workers are created equal. If it's just supply and demand, then you wouldn't have gender inequality, race inequality, felon inequality, disability inequality. So a version of just wage theory is saying supply and demand doesn't work because we're not all equal. And maybe, just maybe, I don't know much about it, but people with disabilities have a hard time, just like felons have a hard time. Because when they walk in the door, I mean, it would be hard for Marty and me to have a felon in a wheelchair walk in the door. Like, whew. You know, that would at least give us pause.
Thanks a lot, Pat. Marty or Kate, is there any final thoughts as we want to wrap up? We pride ourselves at the Higgins Labor Program in keeping to our schedule, and we're at 2:30, but we can go an extra minute or two if you have final thoughts you want to share on this. I've really benefited from this conversation and your presentation, and I'm just sad that we can't go to Roar's and enjoy some adult beverages or any kind of beverages and continue the conversation. So Kate, you unmuted, so yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just would quickly say I really appreciated our pairing today. I think it's important, as I was sort of trying to make that point about kind of legacy origins of discriminatory, wage policies that date back to, racialized institutions and institutions of slavery and those legacies with the carceral system, right? Which you two are really addressing. And I think there's a lot of important parallels there when we think about racial justice as part of a just wage. So thanks for the great talk today from both of you, and thanks, Dan.
Yeah. Marty, you unmuted?
This has been great. I really appreciate you hosting this and asking us to speak. It's interesting to be Pat's partner, coming from the for-profit, private sector, because we're really seeing the intersection of theory and reality, and it's fun. It's as you said, I think earlier, it's a little messy at times, but working through the problems is kind of a fun thing. Pat, at one point we were talking and I said, Pat, business is always working through these little problems. That's just what we call business.
The business of business is working through problems, and hopefully we can get more people to at least engage the just wage framework and ask normative critical questions. I'm less concerned that particular answers people come to than the desire that people at least entertain the questions, because foregrounding the human and the dignity of each person, which is central to all the presentations you just made and central to the just wage framework, central to Catholic social teaching more broadly, requires us to rethink some of these abstract equations in our various disciplines, not just economics, maybe even political science, maybe even history, which claims to not even have theories at this point. Sociology, certainly too. I don't want to exclude Kate's discipline, or Marty's, who was a sociology major. All right, thank you so much, Kate Maich, Pat Regan, Marty Whalen, Stacia Reisinger, everyone who's presented over the last several months in this Just Wage Forum. We called this Just Wage Forum 2021. The Just Wage, that is now ending in its public component, but the Just Wage Initiative will continue. And at the heart of that continuity is conversations. We're going to resume some in-person conversations at Notre Dame beginning in the fall. Thank goodness we can do that. But we'll probably have a hybrid model moving forward, because we've realized how we can connect folks from as far away as India and bring them into the project, even if we can't afford and they don't have the time to jet over for a day or two. So please stay tuned, everyone who's joined us today or any of these other sessions, and look for news about the Just Wage Initiative moving forward. Do not hesitate to reach out to me via email primarily to give me ideas, feedback, next step suggestions. I want to thank everyone over the last several months. Again, this has been really affirming to me in terms of the questions that we're asking. And I hope that we can continue these conversations with these local folks, as well as those in Pennsylvania, Chicago, soon, and elsewhere. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and I hope you all have a good weekend.